Good evening. My name is Alan Price, and I am director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. And on behalf of all my museum and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this event, whether you are here in person or visiting us online. If anybody needs an assisted listening device, you could raise your hand, and one of the technicians will get one to you. To open, I humbly start with a land acknowledgement to recognize that the land on which we stand and sit was once stewarded by Indigenous peoples. And while a land acknowledgement by itself is not enough, it is an important way to promote Indigenous visibility, and it serves as a reminder that we are on stolen and settled Indigenous land, and I invite all of us to contemplate how to better support Indigenous communities and to learn how to honor and take care of the land that each of us inhabits. Tonight's program is presented as part of the Kennedy Library Forum series, and I'd like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and CVS Health, as well as the Mass Cultural Council and our media sponsor, the Boston Globe. We also thank the JFK Library Foundation members who make it possible for the JFK Library to carry forward President Kennedy's legacy to new generations. Thank you to those of you who are joining us tonight, and more information about that membership program can be found on our website. If you're interested, we're always delighted to welcome new members. I've received a reminder from people who've observed this room already that perhaps it would be good just to take a moment and check to make sure your cell phones and other mobile devices are silenced. Thank you for doing that. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. When the question and answer begins, we will invite those of you who are joining us in person to proceed to the microphones in the aisles to ask your questions. Drew Gilpin Faust has kindly agreed to sign copies of her memoir following tonight's program. Our bookstore has copies available for sale if you are interested. It's a great book. You really should be interested. Tonight, we are thrilled to have this opportunity to explore a very personal perspective on one of the most consequential periods in American history with one of the most insightful historians of our time. I am delighted to welcome Drew Gilpin Faust to the Kennedy Library. She is the Arthur Kingsley Porter University Research Professor at Harvard University, where she served as president from 2007 to 2018. She came to Harvard in 2001 as founding dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study after 25 years on the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania. Faust is the author of 7 books, including This Republic of Suffering, Death, and the American Civil War, which was awarded the Bancroft Prize, was a finalist for the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize, and was recognized by the New York Times as one of the 10 best books of 2008. Necessary Trouble, Growing Up at Midcentury, is her most recent book. I remember the day that I received a call from Drew. I was president of a small liberal arts college in the Midwest, and Drew was gathering data from college presidents around the country before she began important work advocating on behalf of the liberal arts. And I was so impressed that I was always struggling to figure out how to best champion my one small college, and Drew was out there doing work to champion all of our colleges, and for that I was forever grateful. I'm so pleased to welcome our moderator for this evening, Paula Johnson, the 14th president of Wellesley College. She is a pioneer who brings decades of experience in the fields of academic medicine, public health, and higher education. Since joining Wellesley in 2016, she has moved the college to the forefront of STEM education for women and has led the creation of the school's strategic plan, which places inclusive excellence at the heart of the Wellesley experience. Previously, she served as a professor of medicine in women's health at Harvard Medical School and of epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and founded the Connors Center for Women's Health and Gender Biology at Brigham and Women's Hospital. She has received several honorary degrees and numerous awards for her contributions to science, medicine, and public health. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Well, Drew, it is, first of all, thank you. It is just wonderful to be here in conversation with you. We go back a long time.
We do. Thank you so much for doing this, Paula. And I think your perspectives on the questions at hand will be really illuminating for all of us. Paula and I met probably in 2001 when I first came to Harvard to run the Radcliffe Institute, and she is a Radcliffe alum and somebody I turned to for wisdom and insight, and have been doing so ever since, and proudly watching now as she navigates Wellesley in such a remarkable way in difficult waters. So,
well,
Paula, thank you for taking the time to do this.
Thank you, and you have been a real guide, and I just so appreciate your leadership. And I think tonight it is, to me, so meaningful to be here at the JFK Library. Given your memoir. It was such an important time in history during which you came of age. And, it was a time of tremendous hope with civil rights, a time of fear, the Cold War, and a time of tremendous loss with the Vietnam War. And your story really spans that whole decade of really that coming of age. So I hope that we can kind of really touch on all of those areas this evening. But the place where I really want to start is on gender. You and I are both deeply rooted in women's education. You at Concord Academy when it was all girls, and then Bryn Mawr, and obviously I went to Radcliffe. By that time it wasn't all women, but clearly had that rooting, and of course here at Wellesley. You grew up in 1950s Virginia, and your mother grew up in a wealthy New Jersey home, then came to Virginia as she married your father. And your book really starts with a harrowing experience. You come home from Bryn Mawr, it's Christmas Eve, and your mother has an undisclosed illness. Your father takes her to the University of Virginia Hospital. She has emergency surgery, and she tragically passes away at age 48. And you and your mother had a difficult relationship. Can you reflect on back then, what was it that you were pushing against, and what was it that you were embracing?
So my mother died at age 48 from an illness that's never been really clarified, but she was emaciated. She was about 5'9" and weighed 90 pounds and was kind of disappearing before our eyes. And I try to make the point in the book that this was very much parallel to her erasure of herself as she became a wife and mother and decided that all the things that had mattered to her in life and that she was really good at would be put aside in favor of her obligations to her husband and children. And she did this, but she never seemed content about it. And she often said to me, as she tried to make me into a Southern lady, and I resisted, she would say, "It's a man's world, sweetie, and the sooner you learn that, the better off you'll be." And I think she said it with a certain bitterness. And I was very aware that she was an unhappy person, though none of us really paid attention to the physical manifestations of that. So I begin my book with this story of her death on Christmas Eve and the kind of surprise and shock and horror with which we reacted to this event. But it begins also with a kind of chronicle of her life and how little she was permitted to dream about or aspire to in the very rigid roles that were prescribed for her. And then I moved to a chapter that chronicles my grandmother's life. And she too was a kind of force of nature who had to stand aside for the men who were the ones that mattered in the world in which she lived. When she was a young wife, at the time of the First World War, her husband and father and brother were all off in France. My great-grandfather had gone to West Point, graduated in the 1880s, was called back to military service, or volunteered. I mean, he wasn't drafted, but he was asked to come back, and he commanded troops on the Western Front. And while he was doing that, his only son, my grandmother's brother, was killed in an airplane. This was the very beginning of airplanes, and they were extraordinarily dangerous, and he crashes and dies in the North Sea about a month before the war ends. And my grandmother writes to her father and says, I know that he was the one that mattered, that a girl is never the same, that the name of the family will now end with his death, and that he cannot be replaced. And so here she is saying, she doesn't matter. What mattered was the son who was lost. And so as I thought about as a child what I could understand of the lives of these two women who were so prominent in my existence, they were both so unhappy and frustrated by the world that relegated them to this second-class status. And I was like a pain in the neck from the very beginning, I think, fighting against that fate. And so that, when my mother died, we hadn't resolved anything. We'd been at complete loggerheads as I demanded to do things that she thought were inappropriate for a young woman who she was trying to make into a lady. And so we fought over everything from the time I was very small, and fought over little lace panties that she wanted me to wear over my regular Carter's underwear. And I said, this is ridiculous. Why do I need 2 pairs of underpants? Forget it, I'm not wearing these fancy pants. I was like 2 when I started with this. And that continued in a variety of other dimensions up until the time she died. In fact, just one more story and then I'll be quiet and let you ask another question.
I love it. I think they're great.
But there was a reception after her funeral, and members of the community came to our house, and there was lots of alcohol, of course, because this was Virginia. And one woman came up to me, and I had very long straight hair. It was 1966. And that was not acceptable. That was like you were a hippie if you had long straight hair. And so it was a matter of great contention between my mother and me, why I didn't have a little permanent, why I insisted on this long straight hair. So this neighbor comes up and grabs my hair and pulls it really hard. I think she'd spent some time at the bar. Pulls it really hard and says, you killed your mother, you know. And so that
and you said?
I said, at least I haven't killed myself. And so that sense of having to stake out a place for myself that was different from my mother's place and my grandmother's place was a matter of survival.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think it's truly amazing that as a child, you had a good sense of this. And, you know, as I had mentioned, your mother nor your grandmother, I mean, they were really limited in a way without education. But you had this passion for learning, and that was almost all self-directed. And where do you think that came from? I mean, I have been so struck by the fact that you got yourself to Concord Academy, which was no small feat in 1950s, late 50s, 1960.
Well, there was a certain irony in that my grandmother, who grew up in Tennessee, was sent to New York City to Miss Spence's school. Some of you may know about Spence School today. It took boarders back in the early 20th century. And so she went to this school, and her teachers recognized she was very bright and urged her to take the collegiate course. And she said, no, I don't want to be one of those blue stocking ladies who's educated. That's not what I want. She was recoiled in horror. And I think she probably regretted that her whole life, because she was very much a reader. She was always wanting to find people to talk to about ideas. And my own mother was a terrible student. She never finished high school. I got all her report cards that were just awful. I think she might have been dyslexic or something of the sort. I mean, she was truly a terrible student. And even though she never had education, she thought it was important for her children, for my brothers more than me, but she didn't exclude me from that sense of, you need to be educated. And so when I turned out to be a really great student, she complimented me, but always insisted, don't think that's the main thing in life. It's great you're good in school. And then once I overheard her saying that she wished my older brother had inherited my brain. Now, he wasn't stupid. I mean, he's a lawyer, he's great. But I was the one who was like dogged student. And my mother thought it was sort of a waste. But nevertheless, she sent me away to school and wanted me to, learn things. And so she was both supportive and not about that. So I escaped to Concord. I really did escape in an important way to a world run by women, where the sky was the limit about what we could learn or think, and it changed my life.
We're going to talk about that. But I do want to just revisit a little bit more of your childhood, because your passion for education as a child and your sense of justice were really profound. And there's a story that I know has been talked about a lot, and you were driving home, being driven home at age 9 by a black man who worked for your family, Raphael, and you heard on the radio that Virginia did not allow Negro or colored children to attend school with white children. And it had never occurred to you that this was the reason why your school was all white. And you were deeply, deeply pained and disturbed by this realization. You viewed it as an anathema to what you had learned about American democracy and Christian values. And you decided to write a letter to President Eisenhower and ask him to please let colored children attend school with white children. Now, the letter, for those of you who have read the book or will read the book, is actually in one of the first pages before the book. It's one of the entry pages, and it's wonderful because it's in your 9-year-old handwriting that you found. You were able to find the letter when you were in the archives, when you were researching the book. Did they not put it in the paperback copy?
There
it is.
Here it is. Here's my little letter, my little crabbed 9-year-old hand.
It's just wonderful, and I was so moved in reading it as you talked about the fairness or the unfairness of not allowing black children to go to school, the need for education, the importance of education, and that all of us were God's children. Those were your words. So at 9 years old, this is kind of the way you're moving. We're here at the JFK Library. What moved you to write to President Eisenhower?
Well, this is a presidential library story because this letter is in the Eisenhower Library in Kansas. And I always told myself as I was growing up, well, I wrote this letter to Eisenhower when I was 9 years old. And I began to wonder, did I make that up? Did I make it up because it's such a great story? And so in about 2003, I think, it occurred to me, I'm a historian, I'd just written a book about women in the Civil War and Southern women who were writing, I sat hours in the National Archives reading letters to Jefferson Davis. I thought, probably this letter is preserved if I wrote to the president. So I reached out to the Eisenhower Library and they found it, which was just a miracle. And I did indeed write it. I hadn't made it up. But I waited to get a copy of it. It wasn't the time when people scanned things and sent them right off. I waited like 10 days, and I wondered, what on earth had I said? And I was very struck by how much religion there was in this letter. Because we went to church, I went to Sunday school, but I was not from a family that was devoutly religious. We didn't even say grace. And yet that Christian notion of the hymn about children black and brown and yellow are all God's children, I was quoting from that and urging Eisenhower. There's this phrase in this letter where I tell Eisenhower, as you know, Christ was born on Christmas Day to save us all. And I was really bossy. I was being bossy to the President of the United States. And I wonder if God seemed to me a higher authority. If I was going to try to persuade the president, I needed a higher authority on my side. So it's very suffused with Christian values and with, as you said, American democracy. And I wonder why it occurred to me to write to the president. I wonder if my weekly reader, did any of you have the weekly reader, had a story about kids writing to the president, or how I got the idea. But I felt empowered to do that. I never told my parents, and so when this letter comes back from the White House, they're like, what? What is this? Where did this come from? Yeah. It was not from Eisenhower, it was just some acknowledgement from a staff person. I think another part of your question, that was why did I do it? I think these ideas came in no small part. They came from my Sunday school. They came from being taught about American democracy in school. But the idea about fairness, I think that came from having 3 brothers and seeing that they were allowed to do things that I wasn't. And so it's not fair was a kind of refrain of my childhood. And so when things seemed not fair, I felt motivated to speak or resist, because I felt things were not fair. Things had happened to me. But then when I realized about segregation and what the real racial arrangements in my society were, that was a much bigger unfairness than my having to wear little lace pants. So that struck me very powerfully. And I think it's worth saying also that the reason this was being discussed on the radio so that I could overhear it was because Brown v. Board required Virginia to supposedly, with all deliberate speed, integrate its schools. And that made race and segregation a matter for public conversation in a way it hadn't been. The racial arrangements in my childhood were never spoken of until suddenly they were spoken of all the time, as our Senator Harry Byrd advocated closing all the public schools in Virginia rather than integrating them. And so there it was on the radio when no one had told me about this. And I think I was as angry about learning about this unfairness as I was about not having been told. I felt betrayed. Why had no one told me this? Yeah. Why had my parents hid this from me? Could I trust anybody after that? And I think that was like the beginning of my what became my student activism.
And we're going to talk about that. But I do think it was profound that, you did have this sense that at that moment of understanding why things were the way they were. And imagine all the young people who had no idea or who didn't have those insights to not understand why an all-white school or an all-white community was in fact all-white. It wasn't just because that was the way it was, but that was the way it was designed to be. Yeah. And you're right, you really carried that forward. So let's go to Concord Academy, because that clearly sets us up for your activism moving forward. And at age 15, when you were at Concord, there was a summer trip that you went on. I'm going to talk really about 2 summers, but the first, you were behind the Iron Curtain when John F. Kennedy was giving his big speech at the Berlin Wall. You were, in fact, in Berlin. And, that must have been quite an experience. You went with an integrated group of students to really promote peace and understanding. And to be there at that moment in time, tell us about what the impact of that trip was.
Well, the reason I decided I wanted to do this was, I think in no small part, because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which had happened the preceding fall. My trip was in the summer of '63. The Cuban Missile Crisis was in the fall of '62. And this was a profound event for me and my classmates. And I remember sitting around one evening in the classroom building at night after classes were over, and we were sitting on the desks and talking to each other about whether the world was about to end and what we would most regret having missed if the world blew up, and what it would mean for the future of the planet. And that sounds a little bit high school girl hysterical, But it actually wasn't. You know, what we know now about the Cuban Missile Crisis, we came very close to having a nuclear confrontation. And so we were, in some sense, right to be asking those questions. And so when later in the school year I came across this flyer that said this group, kind of Quaker-sponsored group, was going to go into Eastern Europe to try to reach out to students so that we could speak with one another and try to build a basis for world peace through human connection. I thought, I want to do that. I want to go talk to these people who are just like me, only they're not. And I want to see what this other world of communism, because having grown up in the rhetoric and all the emphasis on the Cold War, this seemed so important. So I went on this trip, and the summer of 1963 was quite a time. First of all, Kennedy was there at the Berlin Wall, but it was also the summer of a lot of civil rights demonstrations, including the Birmingham demonstrations, the Children's Crusade. And so the Soviet propaganda machine, the Eastern European propaganda machine, was constantly distributing horrible photographs saying, this is supposedly, this is what American democracy really is. Look at these racial arrangements. And so a lot of our conversations, especially since we were an integrated group, was how can you be this way together when we're told that the world is, in the United States, is so unjust and unfair? And we were kind of the embodiment of the contradiction, the refutation of that narrative. And people would come up to the black people in our group and touch them and touch their hair. They'd never seen a black person before. And then we danced. They had all kinds of subversive rock and roll groups, and members of our group would sing with them, and we all did the twist. And I think we probably did more for world peace through doing the twist.
It'd be interesting to find out what all of you, I know what you're doing, but what everyone is doing today.
Yes. But it was a powerful summer in which I began to see differences in the communism of Yugoslavia from the communism of Czechoslovakia, from the communism of East Germany. So communism didn't seem so monolithic. It also had a human face for me after that. And arguing with East Germans about their society and their aspirations gave me just a whole set of new perspectives on our society as well.
Well, and you really followed that thread through your high school experience, that humanization of the other, and how do we learn more and learn deeply about others who are different. And the next summer, 1964, you went to the Deep South on a Quaker trip, again with an integrated group of students. Now remember, this is the summer, the 1964, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we have Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner who were killed. It is a tumultuous time in the United States and in the South in particular. You go with a group of students and you live with black families in the South. And you're really in touch with young people who have gone to jail.
Yes.
Their deep, deep commitment to this cause is something that has a real impact on you. And I do want to share something you wrote, because I think to think about a 16-year-old writing, and I think you might have been 16 at this point.
Yes, I was.
At the end of the summer, you wrote an essay, and at the end of the essay you say, a free individual's actions are not controlled by his fear of public disapproval or of foreclosure of his mortgage or of death, but he consciously weighs all things and acts as he wishes. This kind of freedom can only come from a commitment to that about which one truly cares, for only then do the superficial things in life seem to cease to matter. And I thought, wow, that was deeply moving, very meaningful. And if I put those two experiences together, how did that shape you moving forward?
Well, the summer in the South is something I still can't forget. It was We began by gathering in Washington, D.C. in a Quaker facility there for orientation. And the Civil Rights Bill had just been passed, so there was a Civil Rights Act that now had to be enforced. And the day we gathered, we learned about the disappearance of Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney in Mississippi as part of Freedom Summer. And so there was this backdrop the whole time we were in the South up until early August when their bodies were found tortured and dead. And so that sense of precariousness, of risk, was very much a part of the whole undertaking. But the Civil Rights Act also gave us this sense of possibility. We, in many instances, spent time together testing the Civil Rights Act, seeing if blacks and whites would be served together in the AW root beer in Orangeburg, South Carolina, whether the law was being complied with, and whether we together could move through the South in safety and in confidence. And so it was a scary time, but I kept meeting the most extraordinary people who had, the family I stayed with in Orangeburg had a 9-year-old son who had been in jail a dozen times. Some of the young people in our group had risked their lives for years, even though they were 18 years old. They had been active fighting for their freedom. In Birmingham, we met children who were part of the Children's Crusade. I stayed with a family in Birmingham who were part of the city called Dynamite Hill, where houses had been bombed by segregationists because people in those families were active in civil rights. And the father of that family was a physician, and he said the preceding summer he had spent many a night lying on his stomach with a rifle aimed out the window so that he could protect his family if someone came by with a bomb. The family next door was the family of one of the little girls who was killed in the church bombing. So I had seen people I was spending time with people who had risked so much and were willing to say there were things that mattered more than the superficialities of life, and things that one would dedicate one's life to achieve and to preserve or to make possible. And I just felt this is so meaningful, and that human beings can expand themselves to do these kinds of courageous things. Profiles in Courage. I was confronted with Profiles in Courage that entire summer. And I admire those people still. A little anecdote. This past winter, I was a faculty leader on a Harvard civil rights trip to the South, and we got to Birmingham, and we walked into the museum there, and someone handed me a letter. And I opened the letter, and it was from a kind of grande old dame of the civil rights movement who had founded the museum that we were going in. She said, "You talk about Cookie, the young woman in the house that you stayed in when you were in Birmingham, the daughter of the physician." She said, "Cookie is," and she gave me her name and phone number. "She's still living with her mother. She's eager to hear from you."
Oh my gosh.
And so
how amazing.
I was just stunned, and the woman had read my book and seen about Cookie. So I got back in touch with Cookie and her mother, and we reminisced about that summer and everything that's happened since.
Oh, how amazing.
So this book has been kind of
It's
hands
been a
across
connector.
hands across the decades back into that time.
Just amazing. So you had these remarkable experiences. Of course, you did go to school too at Concord, but these amazing transformative experience. Tell us a little bit about your activism at Bryn Mawr.
Well, I arrived at Bryn Mawr just after this summer. I mean, the summer ended, I think our trip ended the end of August, and Bryn Mawr started 2 weeks later. So I went right from this intensity into this ivory tower of intellectualism that is wonderful in its own way, but completely different from life on the line kind of activities. And I felt kind of frustrated in college first, but I got into the rhythm of things until the spring semester, when one day I was watching television and saw the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge with John Lewis having his head bashed in. And I knew I had to do something because the people who were being beaten up and terrorized were not exactly the same people that I had been with 8 months before, but they were the same people that I had been with 8 months before. They were the Selma version of what I had seen in Birmingham and Orangeburg and elsewhere. And I thought, I have to go. I have to go and join the march. And Martin Luther King then invited people and said, come bear witness. And I said to my boyfriend, we need to go to Selma. And he said, what? And I said, we need to go to Selma. He said, okay. So we borrowed a car, and I realized that it was about to be midterm time and that the biggest paper of the freshman English class was due. And I just said, I'm going to Selma. So I went to see one of my professors and said I was doing this. And maybe he could give me a makeup, or I can't remember what he did. I didn't flunk out, but anyway. He was very wonderful. He said, do your parents know about this? I said, no. He said, well, I want you to call me every 24 hours while you're in the South. And if I don't hear from you, I'll send in the cavalry. I said, what do you mean, cavalry? And he said, I don't know, but I'll do something. So he kind of he had this monitor idea. And off we went. And I cut various midterms and handed in a terrible draft actually gave it to my roommate to type and handed in this terrible paper and went to Selma and drove 100 miles each. We'd each take a 100-mile stint until we got there. And we got there just in time to join the first day of the big march that ended up in Montgomery with all the famous people at the end. We did not go all the way to Montgomery because after the first day, the court arrangement was that only 300 people could march for the next 20 miles. And those were the leaders of appropriately, the leaders of the Selma movement and so forth. And so we just did the first 9 miles. But that was unforgettable too. And I had a kind of interesting experience because halfway to Selma, President Johnson announced that he was going to nationalize the Alabama National Guard. And we thought, oh good, now we're safe. Because there had been such terrible assaults on the marchers in the preceding marches. And we thought, okay, now we'll have troops protecting us. So we arrived in Selma and parked the car, worried that someone might put a bomb in it, which was something that happened to a lot of cars, but gingerly heading towards the Brown Chapel where everyone was gathered. And these 2 Alabama National Guardsmen were walking towards us. And I was very pleased to see them, and I gave them a big smile. And as the 2 walked by, one of them reached out and just slugged me in the breast. And I was stunned. I wasn't badly hurt, but I thought, okay, it is the Alabama National Guard, and maybe they've been nationalized, but they don't like it. And they were just kind of expressing their disapproval of my presence in their state.
Well, you were also, I love the fact also that when you had to find a place to sleep, you slept in the car in the Mawr house, in the Mawr house parking lot. But we won't talk about that one. They just let you stay there. But you were also very active in the anti-Vietnam War movement. I mean, I was impressed with the teach-ins that you helped to organize and a lot of that work that was really took a lot of time and focus. I want to bring it up to just a little bit of comparison for today because it's no secret we've been living through quite a tumultuous time on our campuses. Last year, our campuses were really roiled with protest about the Israel-Hamas war. And a lot of people have said to me, there are parallels to the 60s. They liken it to the 60s. What are your thoughts about that in terms of parallels, differences? How do you see those?
Well, I think the passion of young people is present in both eras. But as I think about what our life was like and what our campuses were like in the 1960s, it's so strikingly different from today. Our campuses were much more homogeneous. And when we were supporting peace in Vietnam, we weren't at odds in a serious way with other inhabitants of the student body on our campus. Our ire was directed at the government and at the war machine, but there wasn't the sense of students side by side intensely feeling and being affected in different ways by the war. The draft was obviously affecting young men and the girlfriends and sisters and mothers and so forth of young men, but it was not upsetting to other students. They might disagree, they might be conservative, but it wasn't existential, the division.
Yeah.
And I remember last fall talking to a student who I taught the preceding year, and he was telling me, and this was probably November, about a young woman who was 2 doors down from him in his house, dormitory. That's what Harvard calls upper class dormitories. And this young woman woke up on October 8th and looked at her cell phone, and there was a video of her brother being beheaded because Hamas had taken his phone, filmed this, and sent it around. This young woman, how could she have a civil discourse about this? I mean, this is a trauma, terrible, terrible blow that emotionally is, I don't know how she grapples with to this day. And then you have students whose friends were shot in Burlington, Vermont because they were wearing keffiyehs. And what about those students? And we're asking these students to share a bathroom, to share a dining hall. It's a lot. It's really a lot. And so I think the goals that we've pursued with such vigor of having everybody from every walk of life and every part of the world talk to one another and live together, it's a wonderful ideal. But it has really been tested in circumstances where such terrible things have happened to individuals who we're asking this of.
And I do want to get back to that in a bit, because higher education is under attack, and we've got divisions on our campuses that are reflective of divisions in society. But let's return to that. I do want to talk to you a little bit about affirmative action, because it's something very front and center for us. It comes out of the civil rights movement. And in fact, you yourself describe being a beneficiary of gender-based affirmative action. When you were finishing up your PhD, University of Pennsylvania was really kind of being told or being urged to hire more women. And they told your department that if they hired a woman, they'd give them another tenure line, and we know what that means. Tenure lines are like gold.
Yep.
So you were recruited into that line.
Yes.
And so I guess, there's so much, affirmative action is so contested from so many different vantage points. There's a lot of support as well. But one of the major issues that's always brought up is that those of us, and I say us because I too have been the beneficiaries of affirmative action, that it has a negative impact on us. That in fact, it in some way irrevocably damages our ability to really embrace our ability to do the work or a sense of belonging. How did it impact you? Or did it?
I don't think I ever doubted that I was qualified or that I could not just fill the position I was given, but really excel at it. It was kind of just put me in, coach, just, let me have a shot here, and don't marginalize me the way you have marginalized the women that I've seen around the university during my time at Bryn Mawr. I had lots of female professors. As a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, I had none, 0 in my time as a graduate student, 1970 to 1975. And so I felt it's important that I be here, and I'm as good as any of these other people, and I'm going to go win the Bancroft Prize one of these days, and just let them say that I wasn't good enough. I don't think it had that kind of impact at all. But it was clear, and I'm sure this happened to you, Paula, that people would make little gender-based remarks and dismissive remarks, and so you had to keep powering through. You didn't just get the tenure track job and off you went and everything was solved. It was still a struggle to push back against that and to have to do twice as well so that people would recognize that you were half as good or as good. And I mean, did you ever doubt yourself because of affirmative action?
No, I don't think so. I think I probably doubted myself at different points, but just because I was in an environment that was extraordinarily rigorous. I think that it's a sense of your own self-worth, who's around you, and I think a sense of real responsibility, that in a certain way, if you turn it on its head, it is an honor, and it comes with that sense of, if not you, then who? And how do you then make your way? Because it is critically important, not only for you, but you've opened those doors to so many behind you.
And I think that for me, going to Bryn Mawr College for women, very intellectually rigorous, and seeing all these female professors, I thought, that's something I could imagine doing. And growing up in Virginia, I knew no women who were professionals, no business people, no doctors, no lawyers, zero. So there was no model. And then suddenly, here was a model, and that mattered enormously. And as you were speaking, Paul, I was thinking about something that I believe is true, which is we got to say some good words for men, in that as I was navigating through this, there were some men who said, don't doubt yourself, you're great, go for it, and who really believed. And that mattered a lot because they could represent me in the larger environment and also kind of reality check me when I'd think, wow, this is hard. And I said, you'll be fine.
Yeah.
And so people who were in place, in power, who were mentors to those of us who wanted to join. I think that was very important.
No, absolutely. So let's just get to the current. When you were president of Harvard, the Students for Fair Admissions, the case was brought against affirmative action, and you testified at the initial district trial court, the court trial. And in 2022, you went to the Supreme Court to hear the oral arguments, and you wrote what was really it was a brilliant and moving article. If you haven't read it, it's in The Atlantic, The Blindness of Colorblindness. And, this is our first school year, our first class entering post the banning of race-conscious admissions. So we've all lived through this first year, and we've seen where we've landed. And Wellesley, like many of the highly selective colleges and universities, we saw a significant decrease in the number of underrepresented minorities. And for us, we saw a significant decrease in Blacks and the Latinx population. I mean, I think this is a real devastating blow. And, obviously it's year one, and it isn't going to be a sprint. It's going to be for the long haul how we address this. But, think about this in also the context that we're seeing increased segregation in public K through 12 schools, and this is now 70 years after Brown versus Board of Education, after you experienced that early reckoning with it. As a historian, what do you think about, or how do you see the educational opportunities in our country moving forward, and how do we find our way?
Well, I find it extraordinarily upsetting to every day a different college is reporting about what its numbers are. And there are a few where there hasn't been much change. I think Princeton doesn't have much change. But almost every institution has striking declines in the percentage of non-white students in the student body. And one of the first to report was MIT, and its director of admissions issued a statement that I thought was really powerful. And it was a cry of concern, alarm, where he said, we tell these students that they have to operate on a level playing field, but so many Black students in the United States are in high schools that don't offer calculus or that don't have lab sciences. So the playing field is not level from the very beginning. And when we engage in what I called in that article, the blindness of colorblindness, we're fooling ourselves about what our world is really like. And to see declining numbers of African Americans in elite higher education, this reverses the story of my life and the story of what has mattered to me since I was 9 years old. And it's like a punch in the gut. And I find it's so distressing, and I think we have to struggle against it and push back and make sure that these opportunities are available.
Yeah.
Another part of it, and you've already begun to experience it, but some of the reports on these new student numbers include comments from African American students who are already on the campuses about how they can see the declining community and that there are fewer people to undertake all the different roles of supporting one another and the extracurricular activities that have supported the community. So it's not just fewer individual students, it's a transformation of the nature of community, opportunity, identity on our campuses. And that's not to say that each ethnic group or racial group has to isolate itself from the others. That's not it at all. But there are important kinds of support and understanding that are shared among different groups, and we're undermining that as well.
It's so important for the development of young people to have those who are like them around them, at the same time that allows them to then reach out, to really have those difficult discussions, to really learn from our diverse environment. You have to have both.
Yep.
And we really do risk that.
Yes.
But there's a lot of work to do. I do want to talk for just a couple of minutes about the importance of history. As a historian, you have just, you have been such an eloquent supporter of the role of history and our need to really focus on teaching history, on our reflection on history. And if we bring that forward, we're living in an era where when we look at difficult things in our past, you commissioned the first big inquiry of Harvard's complicity with slavery and the fact that slaves worked on the Harvard campus. I was there to bear witness to the amazing ceremony that really brought that to its culmination with John Lewis, who I believe it was at that event where he said you could use necessary trouble. But I think if we think about that work that you did, that you led, that's so important for understanding how we got here. We have politicians today who are really looking at any look at difficult instances, difficult periods in our history, that is in some way not patriotic. The turning back of really denying the teachers the ability to teach history in the way that it happened. And that's happening in public schools and in some public universities. How do we really lift ourselves out of this really devastating time that we're living in?
When I was growing up, and I described this to you earlier, the silences about the realities of race around me and the realities of race in that time and place, the silences were noisy. And when I discovered them, because of the radio and the discussion of Brown v. Board, I was really horrified. And I thought, we're fooling each other. We're living in this act of denial and willful blindness about who we are and where we've come from. And that means we can't understand where we might go. It didn't just cut off the past, it cut off the future in a very important way. With this book, I'm a 19th century historian, I'm a historian of the Civil War, I've not written about the 20th century. But I wanted to write this book as a memoir, but also as a book of history in which my life was situated within a broader context of what was going on in that time. Because I felt that these years, many of which are the same years as what is documented in the exhibits here, the people who experience and remember those years are fewer and fewer. And I wanted to tell that story and be a witness instead of just a recorder of other people's 19th century voices. Because we need to remember, and I wanted people to understand what choices I saw, how I understood the path that was possible for me. Because I think that can illuminate for people the notion of how contingent a lot of our past is or was, and therefore the choices we have that we must make and define. So history gives us that sense of possibilities that occurred in the past and thus possibilities available for the future. And if we deny the reality of that past, we just delude ourselves and narrow our understanding of what our lives might be. I also think of American history as, why don't we want to say we struggled? Mm-hmm. Why don't we want to say we confronted difficult things and overcame them? Why do we want to make it look like it was all so easy and nothing bad ever happened and here we are? Why not tell the story of trying to find a more perfect union and be inspired by what people sacrificed and what people were willing to do to make things better? Because that's what we need to continue to do in our own imperfect way. Yeah. So the burden of perfection and the staticness of perfection, it weakens all of us and it weakens our society.
Yeah. I do want to just, I'm going to take the liberty of asking you, I do want to get to one last question because I think it's an important one that I really want to hear your perspective on. You have written also eloquently, and I hearken back to your Phi Beta Kappa speech from 2024 at Harvard, and you really talked about the importance of higher education. And you said, higher education, universities are designed to question prevailing ideas and assumptions. They are meant to create discomfort, to grapple with the uncertainties and complexities of what they don't know, as well as the realities and meaning of what they do, i.e. truth. Higher education is at great risk today, quite frankly, from the right and the left, from inside and external. Why are universities in such danger today?
Universities, I think, are in danger for many reasons. One is people's disappointment in them, the level of student loans, the cost of higher education. We have done things or failed to do things that would tie us to our constituents in unambiguous ways. So I think that's one part of it. But I also think universities are meant to make trouble. They're meant to make necessary trouble. Good trouble, because they're meant to challenge what we all take for granted. Yeah. They're meant to make us uneasy. Galileo was not a popular man. You know, when we make progress about science or our understanding of ourselves or how we look at the past and reveal some of the realities that aren't so pretty, people get uneasy. But that's how we change. That's where change comes from. That's where improvement comes from. If you're not willing to move beyond the way things are now, you're never going to make things any better. So universities need to be able to do that work and sometimes to say heretical things that will turn out not to be true or not to be worthy of carrying forward, but to be able to also say the heresies that will become the basis for future truths and advances in sciences and social sciences and our understanding of ourselves as human beings. And I think in our society now, everything tends to be quite programmed and message bound. And Paula's the head of a college, I was head of a university. Trying to keep the members of your community on message for anything, forget it. You know, everybody's going to say something that you get to the office in the morning and you think, oh my gosh, how am I going to defend this one? But you do, because even if it was misguided, that's who we are. We want our students to on some level, be outrageous. Not dangerous, not hostile in a way that destroys people, but this is a time for them to speak out, but it's also faculty and researchers need to be able to take risks as well.
Yeah.
And that's not very popular in our society right now.
And it's not popular when there are different poles that are reflected from our society into our universities and colleges. And, you know, how do we cross those divides and how do we embrace discomfort? You and I have talked a lot about that because we're not in a period of time where you want to embrace the discomfort of really digging deeply into the truths of others. But that is what we're here for.
That's what it's for.
So we are going to be turning to the audience, but I just want to say, Drew, thank you for writing Necessary Trouble. It is inspirational. It makes us all really think deeply about that time and about how that time has influenced the present and will continue to influence the future, and of the importance of higher education as really being a product of our democracy, but so essential to the future of our democracy.
Yes.
And you give me hope and give us hope about how we move forward.
Oh, thank you, Paula.
So
You're
thank
very,
you.
very generous.
Thank you. So we'll turn to the audience for questions.
We answered them all, huh?
Over here.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the women, the strong women that spoke tonight, and it gives me hope, you know, to be able to look to strong women, you know, at this time in our country. And I started college 50 years ago, so I was in college from 74 to 78. And I think back to those days, you know, we didn't have calculators. Calculators were not allowed because they economically weren't available to everyone. So we needed to use slide rules. And I always attribute my failure in chemistry to 8 o'clock classes and having to use a slide rule because I never learned how to use a slide rule. But I also think back to just sitting around, and you were talking about, you know, just that, talking to people and talking about social issues and politics and even though I went to college in Massachusetts, presidential candidates came to the colleges, to UMass, and spoke at the primary, you know, during primaries, and we don't see that, you know, in Massachusetts anymore, but there were just so many different. I was just talking to someone today how I took typing in high school because I knew that I needed to type papers, and I saw that as a skill. So that's you know, just kind of where I'm coming from. And both of you, with being in higher education, I do on college campuses, you know, frequently I see the student population, and it is so different. It is these things, I love these things, and all that goes along with it is wonderful. But the society has really changed a lot in 50 years, and 60 and 70 years. But most recently, I think in the last 10 years, because I have, you know, young people in my life that they just, everything's so quick, and people don't seem to talk and communicate in the same way. So I just wanted to get some feedback from you both, being in higher education, how you see a difference in the student population and their interest in a lot of social issues in the same way that you grow up that way.
So I'll start and hand off to you. you raised so many issues in what you say, but one of the very important ones that we really haven't touched on at all tonight is social media and what that does to university life and to student life. I became president in July of 2007, July 1st, and I believe the first iPhone was released on June 25th, so 5 days before I became president. So this was changing everything, and it took us a long time to really recognize the ways that it was corroding student community, turning civil discourse into 200 words, 200 character tweets, isolating people, encouraging young women to compare themselves constantly to the perfect bodies that are posted on the internet and to feel that they were inadequate because they weren't beautiful enough or thin enough or buxom enough or athletic, whatever it might be. And I know you're dealing with the present outcome of all this in ways that I think we're still trying to grapple with. And so that's one hugely important change that is about every aspect of our student life and how we relate to one another.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I'll just say one thing about it, which is that you had talked about just sitting around and talking together and being together. And, Drew and I are fortunate enough to be on campuses that are predominantly residential campuses, in which the education is both inside the classroom and outside the classroom. There is as much learning that goes on in community, in residence, and that has been shaken up a bit. Our students are coming with a far greater knowledge base, so there's a kind of a worldliness that they have that we might not have had, maybe not Drew, but we might not have had. But it's a very different world, and we are undertaking any number of initiatives where we really have to double down on bringing back the art of conversation, teaching the skills of talking across difference. And then there's the how do we deal with things like anonymous social media, which is even kind of another step beyond traditional social media. And then we won't even talk about AI and kind of what that means. So a lot of evolution. We're all really grappling with these issues and trying different strategies. But I think time will tell. The only thing we should say is that we have to be continuously committed to these goals.
Hello. I want to ask, because I've read your book, I'm curious to hear what your thought is about the inequalities that exist today, and also things about gender discrimination and whatnot that you addressed in your book, and how that's changed or has it been mitigated since the time you grew up, or do you just see it in a different form, about the same, but maybe just these inequalities or discrimination and whatnot just appears in different forms. I'm just curious to hear if you felt like we've had progress the last 60 years, or if it's just there's some progress in some areas, but then there's progress that's receded.
Well, my narrative of my life was that things were getting better for women and things were getting better for African Americans, and the world was really moving in a direction where some of the kinds of slurs and accusations that characterized my childhood were unimaginable, and now they're imaginable again. And we're seeing, for example, Roe v. Wade. I went to college at a time when abortion was illegal. I had a friend who almost bled to death after she had an illegal abortion, and we, her friends, couldn't decide whether to take her to a hospital where she might be prosecuted for having an illegal abortion or just hope she stopped bleeding. I do not want to live in that world again, and yet many people across the United States are living in that world again. In terms of African Americans in declining numbers in colleges, that seems to me unthinkable, and yet there it is, it's real. And things that people are saying out loud. Mark Robinson in North Carolina, perhaps most notably and extravagantly, but things not very far from that are said by people who are not seen as extreme. And so I really worry what we've been given permission to say and what's okay now in a way that is not okay at all. And so I think we've got a lot of struggle to push back on this and to really put ourselves in the place I thought we were, and to then continue from there. But I do feel that there's a lot that I thought we were done with as a society in terms of our treatment of one another and our understanding of justice and fairness and what our society should be. And that has been challenged.
Yeah. We are going to have three.
Sorry.
Okay.
I don't want to climb over everybody.
Okay, we can. I've been given the okay that we can. But just let's try to make the questions
I'm going to be real quick.
short. Yeah.
Thank you for bringing me back to the late 60s, early 70s when I was in college, when Margaret Mead was my idol, because I was an anthropology student. I'm a historian. The last 10 years I've been researching Eleanor Roosevelt a lot and talking about her and doing things. Kennedy was close to her. And most recently in the last year, Abigail and the Daughters of Liberty, specifically Mercy Otis Warren, who did a lot of necessary trouble and not even under her own name. So I'm wondering for both of you who your role models were specifically with strong women back then, and what you're thinking about the 250th coming up and us making sure that we not remember the ladies, because most people don't even know what that's about, really what happened, but remembering the women.
Yeah.
So I write in my book that when I was growing up, there were no live role models around me, and I found role models in books. So Nancy Drew was a big role model for me. And I suppose as a historian, I ought to be saying Eleanor Roosevelt or Mercy Otis Warren, but nope, it was Nancy Drew. And Anne Frank was a powerful figure for me, her courage and her determination to lead a life beyond the secret annex. And so that was really where I got inspired. What we should be doing about the 250th is absolutely including a lot of the great work that's been done, not just on famous women, but on women's lives and choices and contexts, and women, Indigenous women, African American women in that period, as well as the Abigail Adams women.
Spinners. I just want to say this. I just watched a documentary about Carolyn King, and it was fabulous. Really, about her. Nancy Drew was my role model.
Yeah. And
So who are your role models?
I'll just say one, and the person who comes to mind is Shirley Chisholm. And I was a child when she was elected, and she was my representative. And my mother actually took me to, I'm from Brooklyn.
Me too.
Oh, we will talk later. But my mother took me to the voting booth, and she would take me usually, but this was a very particular day, because she said, this is making history. And, she's the first black woman elected to Congress. And then, the rest is history. But very, very moving. And I think her boldness, her courage as the first, woman running for president on a ticket was, in the primaries, very, very powerful.
That's great. That's great. I love the story about going to vote.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi. So I have a question from our online audience, from somebody who is a fan of your book, The Republic of Suffering, Death, and the American Civil War, and was wondering if you have any plans to write more about the Civil War or about war in general.
Oh, such a great question. This person might be interested to know, I don't want to sound like an advertisement, but I guess I will when I say this. I've written a new introduction to this Republic of Suffering, a kind of 15th anniversary edition. So there's some reflections about the book and thinking about mass death in the era of COVID. And just kind of rethinking some of the questions that arose in that book. I'm working now on a book on American speeches, because a course I taught on American speeches turned out to be such fun for me, and I think for the students, and I'm now trying to build on that and write a book. But I have another project in mind if I lived long enough that would take me back to the Civil War. So ask the person to stay tuned, and maybe I'll come up with a new take.
Hi. First, thank you, President Johnson. I'm a very happy graduate of Wellesley, class of 90.
Wonderful.
And what I loved about college life was that intellectual vigor that you so strongly want to continue. I went on to get more degrees before I then decided to be an urban ESL teacher. And my question to you is, it's, as you know, urban education, it's very messy. The systemic problems are long. And I notice in the 15 years I've been there how hard it is to sustain young people in this field of public service. The intellectual life that they've had, which is so rewarding, though to bring the theory into practice is very discouraging. So I wonder what you have to say to help promote engagement and resilience in something as important as public education. Thank you.
Do you have thoughts about that with your current Wellesley students?
Well, you know, I think it's a really wonderful question that I think can be answered from a number of perspectives. But as you were talking, and you talked about public service, what it brings to mind is the need for focus on civic education. And civic education, K through 12, but also, quite frankly, through higher education. And how do we raise that or renew that civic purpose of education? And I think about some of the conditions that we live under today, you know, the questioning of the peaceful passage of power in the United States. Some of the things that Drew was talking about earlier, the rights of women, separation of church and state. It feels like we are losing our way, and how do we get back those core foundations of what an American democracy actually means, and what is your role as an individual, but as a community in that? That is something much greater than you. It's a much greater whole. And I mean, we're really working on this at Wellesley, and I know many others are as well, in partnership with a number of other schools. Danielle Allen at Harvard is a real proponent of this direction. But I think we really have to double down on this today.
And I think also the element of public service that we need to tell our students is valued and show our students is valued, and really make it foregrounded in face of the intense vocationalism and ambition of so many of our students. How do we have a luster around public service? I mean, these exhibits show a man who gave his life for public service and swam with somebody on his back when, I mean, that story with the coconuts and all the rest of it, it just, what do you owe to others, and how do you value your life, and how do we create a culture in which part of the resilience for individuals undertaking these jobs will come from the respect that they know they have for being willing to do that work. And that means thinking hard about who we are as a people and what we're going to say is important.
Yeah. And it's all of our responsibility.
Yes, yes.
So.
Hello. I'd just like to say thank you for this event and the talk. I hope that by standing here and sharing, I wanted to add positivity to our conversation. And one, the importance of education at all levels, as well as higher education. I am actually a result of, collateral damage from the Vietnam War. I'm originally from Cambodia. I survived a genocide. In my formative year, from about 4 years old to 8 or 9, I've survived the concentration camp, the genocide. And, you know, our people were executed for being educated, for being professionals. Both my parents were teachers. There were multiple attempts to execute my parents. And so, I know in terms of I literally lived where being educated, you were executed. So the positivity of it is that, we were fortunately, my family were able to escape. Sadly, my father was captured and executed before we could escape, but my mother saved herself, 6 of her kids, 2 of my cousins, from separate concentration camps. And when we were fortunate enough to be sponsored here to Boston, my mother was in her 40s with 8 kids to take care of. To be where we were, for her to still have this value, education. So education made the difference in my life. Education. So, this mindset that it's about mindset, it's about values, so that a woman who was born into poverty, who had to work since she was 4, 5, or 6 years old. She said she had to tend to the water buffalo before she walked to school, all of this and that. So, that when you value it, you hold on to it, no matter how you were suppressed and you could literally be executed, you still hold on to that. And so now, I'm a graduate of Wellesley College. The only Cambodian in my graduating class, my oldest sister, committed suicide my sophomore year. Every day I just wanted to die, but I never gave up. And, my life is being of service, and I've gone through a lot, and I'm passionate and driven to contribute and to give. And so even for higher education, I'm ready to contribute so much more. And the other thing, too, is that I volunteer for the Hispanic Scholarship Fund and the Gates Scholarship. There are children, high school kids, who are from very challenging situations, but they work so hard. They work hard, they overcome a lot, and still do well in school, still have big, audacious dreams. There are upcoming, the current and upcoming emerging leaders of diversified background that we hear so much negativity, but you have to also search and look for the positivity that goes on. And so I hope that by sharing this, that, it's not as doom and gloom, and that some of us, and just like you contribute and others, but that, there are things that we can still do, and that a lot of positive things are still going on, and there are still people, young people, people of all generations and ages and from all diversity who are contributing. And so we just need to, come together more, and our voices and our narratives need to be more empowered, embraced, and lifted up. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that really moving story and really ending us with a note of positivity. And that is why we do what we do. Because in essence, there might be a lot of struggles, but what we do is hopeful.
Yes.
It is essentially hopeful. We wouldn't be here if we did not have belief and hope in young people, in what we do, and in the future. And so, Drew, thank you again, and thank you to the Kennedy Library for hosting us. Thank you.
If I could hold your attention for a moment, because some folks are going to get set up for a book signing, but thank you. Really good, great conversation, wonderful book, and I know you're going to want to get autographed, but I'll entertain you while she gets set up. First, just a public service announcement. Many of you may not know some of the upcoming exhibits. You may be aware of the World War II Service and Sacrifice exhibit. How many of you have seen that so far? So some. So I would encourage you, if you haven't seen it, do come back and see our Service and Sacrifice exhibit. We tend to alternate between more serious exhibits and more, I'll just call them, other family-friendly exhibits. So coming in the spring, the World War II will go down in January. In the spring, we will start Presidential Pets, and seeing the nation's history through the eyes of pet ownership and what pets were in the White House at different times of a nation's history. And then coming soon is America 250 for 2026. And among the many things that we have planned, and I was so glad to see the story in the book about the letter to President Eisenhower, we're going to see a bit of the nation's history through the letters that are sent to the President in the White House every day. And how many of you have ever written to the President of the United States? A few. It is very likely that the presidential library that is about that president has your letter. So if you are ever curious, ask the archivist, hey, do you have my letter from whatever year it was? And they'll dig through. Most of them are still in our collections. And you wouldn't believe, I mean, if you want to take a look at civil rights and just the letters, pro and con on any particular moment, extraordinary. And so I'm excited that we're going to have an opportunity to see the nation's history through the letters from the people. And just looking a little further ahead, 2028, we're going to do a special exhibit on Ernest Hemingway. And 2029 will be the 100th anniversary of Mrs. Kennedy's birth. And we're going to bring out many of the dresses. And I expect that's going to be a very well-attended exhibit. But I hope you'll come and see all of them. That's enough of the song and dance for the delay. Go get your book signed. Thanks for coming this evening.